3,000 years ago, a blind poet named Homer laid the foundation of Western literature with two monumental epics. The first, the Iliad, told of the blood and dust of the Trojan War, a 10-year siege that ended in fire, all thanks to a wooden horse and the cunning mind of a man named Odysseus. But victory, as the Greeks would soon learn, was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a nightmare. While the other Greek kings sailed back to their palaces with spoils of war, Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, wanted only one thing: to see his wife, Penelope, and his son, Telemachus, whom he had left behind as an infant a decade prior. Gathering his fleet of 12 ships, Odysseus stood on the smoking shores of Troy, looking out at the Aegean Sea. He believed the worst was behind him. He was wrong. The journey from Troy to Ithaca should have taken a few weeks. Instead, it would take 10 grueling years. It would become a voyage that would strip Odysseus of his fleet, his friends, and his pride, forcing him to face the most terrifying monsters, vengeful gods, and the darkest corners of his own soul. This is not just a story of a journey home. This is the ultimate test of human endurance. This is the Odyssey. Almost immediately after setting sail, the fleet was driven off course. Needing supplies, they raided the coastal city of the Cicones. It was a brutal skirmish, a lingering echo of the Trojan War, and it cost Odysseus many good men. But the true danger lay further south, waiting for them after a massive storm blew them off the mapped edges of the known world. They washed up on a strange, tranquil shoreline, the land of the Lotus eaters. Odysseus sent 3 scouts inland to search for food and water. Hours passed, and the men did not return. When Odysseus went to find them, he did not find them dead, nor held captive by force. He found them seated peacefully among the island's gentle inhabitants, their mouths stained with the nectar of the lotus flower. The lotus was a powerful narcotic. Whoever ate it lost all desire to return home. They forgot their wives, their children, their past, and their future. They wanted only to stay on that island, eating the flower, suspended in a waking dream forever. For a man whose entire existence was now defined by his drive to return home, this was a terrifying threat. It wasn't a monster with fangs. It was the quiet death of ambition. Odysseus had to drag his weeping men back to the ships by sheer force, tying them to the rowing benches beneath the decks. He ordered the fleet to sail immediately, learning a vital lesson. In this strange new world, comfort could be just as deadly as a sword. Hungry and desperate, the fleet eventually dropped anchor near a lush, uninhabited island. Across the water, they spotted a mainland dotted with caves and massive flocks of sheep. Taking a single ship and a small band of his bravest men, Odysseus rowed over to investigate, carrying a skin of incredibly potent, unwatered wine as an offering. They found a massive cave stocked with giant wheels of cheese and pens of lambs. The men urged Odysseus to steal the food and run, but curiosity and a dangerous sense of entitlement to the ancient rules of hospitality kept him waiting for the cave's owner. The owner soon returned. It was Polyphemus, a Cyclops, a giant with a single eye in the center of his forehead. He drove his massive flock inside and sealed the cave mouth with a boulder so heavy that 20 wagons couldn't move it. When Odysseus stepped forward to introduce himself, demanding the hospitality of the gods, the Cyclops gave his answer. He grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men, smashed their heads against the stone floor, and devoured them raw, bones, brains, and all. Odysseus drew his sword, preparing to stab the monster in his sleep, but his legendary mind stopped his hand. If he killed the Cyclops, they would be trapped in the cave forever, sealed in by the unmovable boulder. They needed the monster alive, at least for a little while. The next night, after the Cyclops ate 2 more men, Odysseus offered him the potent wine. Polyphemus drank it greedily, unaccustomed to alcohol. Intoxicated, he asked for Odysseus's name. Odysseus smiled in the dark. "My name is Nobody," he said. "Well, Nobody," the Cyclops laughed. "As a gift, I will eat you last." When the monster passed out, Odysseus and his men took a massive olive-wood stake they had sharpened and hardened in the fire. With a unified battle cry, they drove the blazing, red-hot point directly into the Cyclops' single eye. Polyphemus roared in agony, thrashing blindly. Other Cyclops gathered outside the cave, shouting, "Polyphemus, who is hurting you? Who is killing you?" The blinded giant screamed back, "Nobody is killing me. Nobody is blinding me." Thinking his pain was a disease sent by the gods, the other giants walked away. The trick had worked. The next morning, when the blind Cyclops rolled away the boulder to let his sheep out to graze, he felt the top of each animal to ensure the men weren't riding them. But Odysseus had tied his men to the undersides of the massive sheep. They slipped out undetected, right beneath the monster's hands. But as they sailed away, Odysseus's pride got the better of him. Standing at the prow of his ship, he shouted his true name to the roaring monster on the cliff. "If anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, king of Ithaca. It was a catastrophic mistake. Polyphemus was a son of Poseidon, god of the sea." Hearing the true name of his tormentor, the Cyclops prayed to his father for revenge. Poseidon heard the prayer, and from that moment on, the oceans themselves became Odysseus's greatest enemy. Cursed by the god of the sea, the fleet sailed on, eventually finding sanctuary on the floating copper island of Aeolus, the keeper of the winds. After hearing the tales of Troy, Aeolus took pity on Odysseus. He captured all the storm winds of the world, bound them tightly in an ox-skin bag, and gave it to Odysseus, leaving only the gentle west wind free to blow the ship straight to Ithaca. For 9 days and 9 nights, Odysseus steered the ship, refusing to sleep. Finally, on the 10th day, the shores of Ithaca appeared on the horizon. He could see the fires burning on his own coast. Exhausted, feeling safe at last, Odysseus closed his eyes. But his crew was suspicious. They whispered that the bag must be full of gold and silver that Odysseus was hoarding for himself. As their king slept, they untied the bag. Instantly, a roaring hurricane erupted. The violent winds blasted the fleet backward, wiping out 9 days of sailing in a matter of hours. They were blown all the way back to the island of Aeolus. But this time, the Wind Keeper turned them away in horror, realizing that a man so unlucky must be deeply cursed by the gods. Demoralized, the fleet rowed manually until they reached the harbor of the Lastrygonians. It seemed like a peaceful inlet, but it was a trap. The inhabitants were a race of gigantic, bloodthirsty cannibals. Standing on the high cliffs surrounding the harbor, the giants hurled massive boulders down on the ships, splintering the hulls and crushing the men inside. They speared the dying sailors like fish and carried them off to be eaten. Odysseus, who had cautiously anchored his ship just outside the harbor, could only watch in horror. Of the 12 magnificent ships that had left Troy, 11 were completely destroyed. Only Odysseus's single ship, and the handful of men aboard it, survived. Grieving and traumatized, the lone surviving ship drifted to the island of Aiaia. They drew lots, and half the men, led by Eurylochus, went inland to explore. Deep in the woods, they found a beautiful stone mansion surrounded by docile wolves and mountain lions that wagged their tails like house dogs. Inside, singing a beautiful haunting melody at her loom, was Circe, a stunningly beautiful witch and daughter of the sun god. She welcomed the men inside, offering them a feast of cheese, barley, and honeyed wine. But the wine was laced with dark magic. As soon as they drank, Circe struck them with her wand. Instantly the men dropped to all fours. Coarse hair sprouted from their skin, their faces contorted into snouts. They had been transformed into pigs, though their human minds remained trapped, weeping inside their animal bodies. Only Eurylochus, who had stayed outside, escaped to tell Odysseus. Armed with his sword, Odysseus marched toward the mansion, ready to die. But on the way, he was intercepted by Hermes, the messenger god. Hermes handed him a magical white flower with a black root, called moly, which would make him immune to Circe's magic. When Odysseus drank Circe's poisoned wine, nothing happened. When she raised her wand, he drew his sword and lunged at her throat. Terrified, Circe surrendered. She turned the pigs back into men, taller and more handsome than before, and took Odysseus into her bed. The crew stayed on Circe's island for an entire year, recovering their strength in a state of luxurious pleasure. But eventually, the longing for home returned. Odysseus asked Circe for the way back to Ithaca. Circe's face grew grim. She told him that to find his way home, he must seek the guidance of the blind prophet Tiresias. But Tiresias was dead. To speak to him, Odysseus would have to sail to the edge of the world and descend into the underworld itself. Following Circe's instructions, Odysseus sailed across the dark waters of the river Oceanus to the sunless shores of the dead. There, he dug a trench and sacrificed a black ram, letting the blood pool in the dirt. The spirits of the dead, starved for the warmth of life, swarmed the pit, thirsting for the blood. Odysseus had to draw his sword to hold them back. It was a terrifying, deeply traumatic experience. He saw the ghosts of brides, young men, and old warriors. He even saw the ghost of his own mother, Anticlea, whom he had left alive in Ithaca. He tried 3 times to embrace her, but his arms passed through her shadow like smoke. She had died of a broken heart, waiting for his return. Finally, the ghost of the blind prophet Tiresias approached and drank the blood. He gave Odysseus a grim prophecy. Poseidon would make the journey agonizing. He warned Odysseus that when he reached the island of the sun god, Helios, he must not let his men harm the sacred cattle grazing there. If the cattle were touched, the ship would be destroyed, and Odysseus would return home a broken man, alone, on a stranger's ship, to a house invaded by enemies. Odysseus also spoke with the ghosts of his fallen comrades from Troy. He spoke with Achilles, the greatest of all warriors, who gave him a chilling truth about mortality. "I would rather be a dirt-poor servant to a landless farmer on earth," Achilles said, "than be the undisputed king of all the dead." With a heavy heart, Odysseus sailed away from the darkness, back into the world of the living. The path ahead was a gauntlet of horrors. First came the Sirens. They were creatures whose song was so beautiful, so piercingly alluring, that any sailor who heard it would throw themselves into the sea to reach them, only to drown or starve on their rocky shores. Circe had warned Odysseus. He ordered his men to plug their ears with softened beeswax, deafening them entirely. But Odysseus, driven by his unquenchable thirst for knowledge, wanted to hear the song and survive. He had his men tie him tightly to the ship's mast. As they entered the Sirens' waters, the haunting melody began. It promised total knowledge, an end to suffering, a release from the burdens of leadership. It clawed at Odysseus's mind. He screamed, wept, and strained against the ropes, begging his deaf men to untie him. But they followed their orders, rowing steadily until the song faded into the wind. But surviving the Sirens only brought them to a deadlier choice. They had to sail through a narrow strait guarded by 2 monsters. On one side was Charybdis, a massive whirlpool that would suck the entire ship down to the ocean floor, killing everyone. On the other side was Scylla, a monster with 6 hideous heads on long serpentine necks, hiding high in a cave. There was no way to defeat them. If he steered toward Charybdis, they all died. If he steered toward Scylla, 6 men would die. Odysseus made the brutal, impossible choice of a commander. He steered the ship closer to Scylla's cliff. He did not tell his men what was about to happen. If they knew, they would drop their oars and hide. As they watched Charybdis churning the water to their left, Scylla struck from above. 6 of Odysseus's strongest men were plucked into the air, screaming his name as they were dragged into the dark cave to be eaten. Odysseus would later say it was the most agonizing sight of his entire 10-year journey. But the ship and the rest of the crew survived. The battered survivors finally landed on Thrinacia, the island of the sun god, Helios. Remembering the prophet's strict warning, Odysseus made his men swear an oath not to touch the sacred cattle grazing there. But the winds died, and a massive storm tracked them on the island for a month. Their food ran out. Starvation set in. One day, while Odysseus went inland to pray to the gods and fell into a deep sleep, his second-in-command, Eurylochus, convinced the starving men that it was better to be struck down by the gods than to die slowly of hunger. They slaughtered the sacred cattle and roasted the meat. When Odysseus woke and smelled the roasting fat, he knew they were doomed. As soon as they set sail again, Zeus, answering the angry prayers of the sun god, unleashed a monstrous hurricane. A lightning bolt struck the ship directly, shattering it to splinters. The entire crew, every last man who had fought beside Odysseus at Troy, drowned in the churning black waves. Odysseus alone survived, lashing the keel and mast together. He drifted for 9 days under the scorching sun until he washed ashore on Ogygia, the island of the beautiful nymph Calypso. Calypso fell in love with him. She offered him immortality, eternal youth, and a life of perfect paradise if he would only stay and be her husband. But Odysseus's heart belonged to Ithaca. For 7 long years, she kept him a prisoner of love. By day, the great hero sat on the rocky shoreline, staring out at the ocean, weeping for his wife, his son, and his home. By night, he was forced to share the bed of a goddess. Finally, the gods took pity on him. Athena, Odysseus's protector, convinced Zeus to intervene. Hermes was sent to order Calypso to release him. Reluctantly, the nymph helped Odysseus build a raft. Even then, Poseidon shattered his raft with a final, spiteful storm. Half-drowned, naked, and broken, Odysseus washed up on the shores of Scheria, home of the Phaeacians. Found by the princess Nausicaa, he was brought to the king's palace. During a grand feast, a blind bard sang a song about the Trojan War and the cunning of Odysseus. Hearing his own tragic history sung aloud, Odysseus broke down in tears. He finally revealed his identity and told the king the unbelievable story of his 10-year wandering. Awed by his tale, the Phaeacians loaded a ship with vast treasures and sailed him home. 20 years after he first left, Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, finally stepped onto the sand of his own homeland, but the island was not as he left it. Athena appeared to him with a grim warning. His palace had been overrun by 108 arrogant young noblemen. Believing Odysseus dead, these suitors had moved into his home, eating his livestock, drinking his wine, and terrorizing his son, Telemachus. Worse, they were demanding that Penelope marry one of them to crown a new king. Penelope had delayed them for years with clever tricks, but her time was up. Athena disguised Odysseus as an old, scarred beggar, so he could infiltrate his own home safely. He reconnected with his loyal swineherd, Eumaeus, and finally, in a tearful reunion in a smoky hut, he revealed himself to his son, Telemachus. Together, father and son plotted their revenge. Odysseus entered the palace in his beggar disguise. The suitors mocked him, threw food at him, and beat him. Odysseus endured the humiliation with chilling patience, observing who was loyal and who deserved to die. Penelope, driven to the brink, announced a contest. She brought out Odysseus's massive, stiff hunting bow. She declared she would marry the man who could string the bow and shoot an arrow cleanly through the rings of 12 axe heads lined up in a row. One by one, the suitors tried. One by one, they failed to even bend the wood to string it. Then, the old beggar stepped forward and asked for a turn. The suitors laughed and insulted him, but Telemachus handed his father the bow. Odysseus took the weapon. He felt the wood, checked it for rot, and then in one smooth, effortless motion, strung the bow. The great hall fell deathly silent. Zeus sent a crack of thunder, echoing across the sky. Odysseus knocked an arrow, drew the string back, and let it fly. It whistled perfectly through all 12 axe heads. He then threw off his beggar's rags, standing tall and terrifying. "The game is over," he roared. Before the suitors could react, Odysseus shot an arrow straight through the throat of Antinous, the cruelest of them all. The suitors leapt up to grab their weapons from the walls, but Telemachus had already locked the armory. They were trapped. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. Alongside his son and 2 loyal servants, Odysseus slaughtered all 108 suitors. The floor of the great hall ran thick with blood. When the screaming finally stopped, the king ordered the hall cleaned and purified with fire. Only then did he go to his wife. Penelope, hardened by 20 years of grief and deception, did not believe it was him at first. She tested him, asking a servant to move their massive bed out of the bedchamber. Odysseus flared with sudden anger. He told her that was impossible. He himself had built their bed around the trunk of a living olive tree rooted into the earth. It could not be moved unless someone had sawed through the trunk. Only Odysseus knew this secret. Penelope broke down, weeping, and threw her arms around his neck. 20 years of war, monsters, gods, and grief melted away in that embrace. The long journey was over. The king of Ithaca had finally come home.